Hello, welcome back, everybody. We're very excited to introduce Dr. David Gill. It's my pleasure. Dr. Gill is an assistant professor at the Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. His research is really exciting in the field of conservation. He works a lot on marine coupled human natural systems, particularly on how to manage marine and tropical coral reefs. So David holds a master's and a PhD from the Center of Resource Management and Environmental Studies at the University of the West Indies, Barbados. And he was a postdoc. We met when we were both postdocs actually at CSINC. He was first a CSINC fellow, a Luke Hoffman fellow. So CSINC is the National Social Environmental Synthesis Center in Maryland. And after that, he was a fellow, a Smith Fellow based at George Mason University and Conservation International. He has published extensively, very extensively, I should say, on a variety of topics: marine conservation, resource economics, marine protected areas, and a lot of interesting work on small scale fisheries. Today, he will be talking about conservation, like evidence-based conservation. The title of his talk is Building an Evidence Base on the Impacts of Marine Conservation. So thank you very much, David. We're very excited to have you.
Thanks, Albert, and thank you for this invitation. Yeah, so as Albert mentioned, my research looks at understanding the impacts of conservation efforts or management, fisheries projects, and how they affect social and ecological systems within coastal marine areas. So I'll just dive right in to talk about some of the recent work that we've been doing, trying to build an evidence base where we are drawing on multiple data sources to understand what it is that we see in terms of impacts of marine conservation on coastal ecosystems, as well as the human communities that depend on marine resources. And a critical policy question for this work it's a simple question, and we hope we know the answer to that question. We definitely hope it is yes, but it's generated a lot of debate. And when I was putting together the paper that I'll talk about here, I was getting ready to do getting all the last bits and pieces ready for the submission. And then I got a WhatsApp message from Mom. And she sends me this video, says, hey, can you look at this for me? So in this video, this doctor says that the flu vaccine has all of these severe side effects, and what you should do is avoid the vaccine. And because I was really busy getting everything done, I did what everyone does and ignore their mom. But then I saw other family members chiming in and saying, yeah, I noticed that when your cousin got the vaccine, he stopped talking for a little while. And then I said, maybe we should think about delaying the MNR vaccine. And I'm like, oh, whoa, okay, this is getting out of hand. I need to intervene here. After all, I'm a scientist. I should be able to convince my family that a lot of the stuff that they see in these videos, that there is no scientific backing. So what do you do on a Sunday afternoon but get on Google Scholar, because I know I'm a scientist, I only care about primary research, and just to get some quick papers and facts to refute what they were saying or seeing in these randomly shared videos. But I got a bit of a surprise. In fact, the first paper that came up talked about the risk associated with thimerosal vaccine and how that can increase risk for atypical autism diagnosis. Then the next paper looked at hepatitis B vaccine and effects on neonates. And they mentioned about boys having a threefold greater odds of an autism diagnosis compared to those who didn't get vaccine in the first month. and then talk about some unequal impacts between different races or ethnic groups. And so this got me pretty concerned that the first few random papers that I pulled up reported these findings. And so what I realized is that looking at these random papers can give you some strong evidence, but what I really need to do is evidence synthesis. And this is a process of pulling together insights from relevant literature to address some topic area or question. Many of you may be familiar with some of the types of evidence syntheses work, from meta-analyses, systematic reviews, can develop conceptual models from the literature, there's vote counting studies. All of this is in an effort to pull together what is the state of knowledge around a particular topic or area. And in the research that I'm doing, it isn't about vaccines, but it is about some measure that is being used to address sustainability challenges. And it's being increasingly used to conserve marine biodiversity around the world. In the past 2 decades, we have seen a rapid increase in the number and sizes of marine protected areas. We've also seen a rapid expansion of certification schemes, such as the Marine Stewardship Council, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and many other certification programs that promote sustainable seafood harvesting. And while these are increasing, they also come with promises of win-wins, where they provide benefits for both ecosystems as well as people. However, in the literature, we do see occasional reports of ecological wins, but social losses, where those who rely heavily on the resource and they're being negatively impacted from conservation. And as such, we do see multiple discourses in the literature around how exactly conservation affects people. So in this review, we set out to address this question. Does marine conservation benefit people? And as we start to think about it, this isn't actually the main question. There's actually a lot of other questions around this that concerns us. We are interested if everyone wins in conservation. Are there certain groups that are always winners or always losers? Do women benefit less from conservation? And the reports that we hear of unequal gender impacts, do we actually see that coming out in the literature? How are different aspects of well-being affected? Does it result in different impacts on health, education, income? And are short-term costs outweighed by the long-term benefits, as hoped by many who are proponents of conservation? And what is the quality of existing evidence? And all these questions actually relate to getting a better understanding of the relationship between multiple impacts, recognizing that conservation and other interventions, even things such as climate change, don't have a single impact on whether it be humans or ecosystems. Oftentimes there are multiple impacts. And here we are actually interested in understanding whether there are synergies, where there's double positive or negative impacts, where there are trade-offs, where we see these wins and loses. And then in terms of equity, understanding who is winning or who's not winning in terms of the conservation impacts. So for this work, we focus particularly on 4 of the main types of conservation strategies: marine protected areas, community-based management programs, certification schemes, payment for ecosystem services, and try to understand whether or not these lead to synergies, trade-offs, and equitable or inequitable outcomes. We sourced quite a few large databases. We used the traditional Web of Science and Scopus, but also unpublished reviews, and where we were able to apply the search string to identify relevant studies. And this is our search string over here on the right. And then we were able to identify 2,600 studies, and using some machine learning assisted software, we were able to screen and identify based on the title and abstract, and then the full text, 75 studies that reported on multiple social outcomes from an intervention. So we're just going to briefly share some of the results. So of these studies, majority focused on impacts from marine protected areas, and these rapidly increase in the last 20 years, which is associated with the increase in the extent and number of marine protected areas globally. And very few studies focus on some of the other types of interventions, such as certification programs like the Marine Stewardship Council. Studies were located in 44 countries, particularly around the tropics in Southeast Asia, where the interventions were aimed at protecting coral reefs or other tropical marine ecosystems. And most of the studies focused on local skill interventions. Now, assessing the relationship between multiple outcomes, realize that there are many different ways you can slice and dice the results. And so we came up with this framework to describe the different types of heterogeneity that we would see in the literature. So understanding what aspects of well-being were affected, the distribution of these outcomes in terms of who, when, and where, and so spatial and temporal elements, directionality of it, positive, negative, or not affected, and then variability in the magnitudes, how much were they affected. And with human well-being domains, we realized that in the literature, the majority focus on economic wealth and livelihoods. This is not surprising because income and wealth is usually the first social indicator that's used when assessing human well-being outcomes. Quite a few studies that looked at aspects related to food security. It was mostly about fish catch, and then with social capital, most of it focused on conflict and cohesion that came about as a result of these interventions. And then political empowerment related to how resource use rights and empowerment and agency changed. And most of the resource use rights focus on access. So how has the access to particular resources changed as a result of the intervention? And with this category, we found that actually led to multiple cascading effects, where those who had access or increased access to the resource, they saw gains in other aspects of well-being, like food security and income and culture and education, whereas those that lost those rights, we saw negative cascading effects. In terms of the distribution of outcomes, we saw heterogeneity, for example, between occupational groups. An example is in the Philippines, where in an MPA, it was said that tourism operators were given greater control over the MPA at the expense of fishers, and that resulted in conflicts between the fishers and tourism operators. We had variation by economic groups, and so this sanctuary in South Africa, it was reported that the poor fishermen were not allowed to fish outside of their area, but these wealthy or the large-scale industrial lobster fishing fleet were allowed to take tons in our backyard, and we have to stay out. In terms of directionality of outcomes, again, where we see cases where actually one group didn't experience just synergies or trade-offs, but actually both at the same time. A common example is where one group was given additional access rights, and that resulted in increased economic wealth as a result of being able to utilize the resource. And then the group that lost those rights, they saw a concurrent decline in economic wealth. But in both cases between groups, that resulted in increased conflict, and so it had a negative impact on social cohesion between the groups. And so, answer to the question, does conservation benefit people? It's complex. Definitely we see synergies and trade-offs, winners, losers, intended and unintended consequences, and cascading effects from these interventions. We also identified particular knowledge gaps in terms of geographies, interventions, outcomes, or looking at the distribution of outcomes by age, ethnicity, gender, and over time. And additional work needs to be done there. But it was hard to leave the question there, because what actually we realized, and from looking at all these synergies and trade-offs, is that we actually don't just care about whether or not people benefit from conservation, but why does conservation benefit some and not others? And this gets into the last piece about how the variation in magnitude of outcomes, and realizing that inequalities in outcomes is actually shaped very heavily by the existing context. We found that how much you benefited or lost as a result of conservation was a factor of your resource use and dependency, the power that you had relative to others in the community, as well as your capabilities and your ability to benefit or adapt to this change. So an example of this was in Cayos Cachinos, where there was pre-existing power hierarchies and social structures within the community between the indigenous Garifuna people, as well as those who were members of a cooperative. And this contributed to unequal distribution of economic benefits from the MPA. In Mafia Island in MPA in Tanzania, they found that unequal fishing restrictions and different fishing histories led to one village or community receiving greater benefits from the MPA and the associated livelihood programs, and where the restrictions targeted the type of gear that the other fishing community used, and not the ones who were more involved in decision making and who ended up receiving greater benefits. And then in Kenya, across a series of community-based MPAs, there was conflict that affected, yes, both women and men, but female fish traders observed less or received no benefits compared to male traders. Other examples is again in Cayos Cachinos, where the Garifuna fishers felt that they were being criminalized as a result of these new regulations, and because of negative interactions with the Navy, they saw increased risk at sea. And again, in some cases where we saw these cascading effects, in the Mnazi Bay Estuary Marine Park in Tanzania, this case where fishers lost access to ancestral fishing waters and had a lot of conflict with the Marine Protected Area Management, and which led to boat confiscations and other economic losses. The women in the community said that children don't get enough to eat as a result, and because of malnourishment, they believe that they started to had lower educational outcomes as a result. On the other hand, the communities that were given ownership and management rights in Indonesia and community-based and customary managed areas in Indonesia and Tonga, they saw an increased collective income and living standards as a result. And so in this case, again, where the property rights were given to this group, they were able to benefit more from the intervention. So we see that it depends how you benefit and why you benefit or lose from conservation has to do with how you interact and depend with the resource, your ability to influence the intervention. So with the case of the tourism operators in the Philippines, whether or not you are given agency and control or that is taken away as a result of the intervention, and property rights, your ability to access and use the resource. And then coming down to capabilities, where if you have the assets, education, and financial resources to either adapt to changes. For example, those that had smaller fishing boats, they were unable to move and fish outside of the MPA compared to those who had larger boats, or if you were able to benefit from the intervention. And there was another example where they were implementing an ecotourism project, which provided a lot of jobs and benefit for the community, but only to those who spoke English or had the ability to interact with tourists. And so those were the ones who benefited more from the intervention. So while we're seeing these changes that are happening in conservation, conservation doesn't happen in a bubble. And all around the world, we're seeing an increase in rapid increase in the effects of drivers of change. For example, East Africa over the past few months has struggled with increased flooding as a result, potentially of climate change. We've seen an historic infestation of locusts as well, potentially linked to climate change as well. And then to add on top of that, we have increased restrictions as a result of COVID, which limits the aid and other the distribution of other goods within the different the countries or communities. And so these communities seem to be at the center of these convergent drivers of change. In other cases, there may be other core root drivers of vulnerability that are factors that lead to vulnerability, such as in Yemen, where the ongoing 5-year conflict has led to historic and one of the world's largest cholera outbreaks. We've also seen a loss of public infrastructure as a result, and then in some cases, reaching levels of hunger that are approaching levels of famine. And this is true for marine conservation as well. Again, it's not happening within the bubble, but these coastal communities are experiencing a lot of change as a result of climate impacts, both from shocks such as storms, as well as other long-term effects from sea level rise. And they're also at the center of increased development and economic activity. For example, within the past 10 years, there's been the coined term of blue economy, where there has been a concerted efforts to invest in ocean-based economies. And how that plays out in these different coastal communities, again, may result in benefits for some and not others. And so we see these coastal human natural systems then in sort of the center of multiple exposures, but particularly at the center of changing climate and the environmental shocks, the pulses and press disturbances that we see there. In some cases, unsustainable or inequitable development within these communities. And then in some cases, unfortunately, when conservation is poorly implemented, that results in cases where the resilience to other shocks can be compromised by poorly implemented conservation or development strategies. And these impacts are particularly acute for groups that are already marginalized and who have high sensitivity to changes in environmental or economic conditions and have the limited adaptive capacity or agency to be able to change or to influence or the design of development and conservation projects. So in summary, we see that marine conservation is having diverse impacts across various social groups, various aspects of well-being, and over space and time. And these outcomes from conservation are quite complex, and that conservation itself reallocates property rights, which has then cascading effects on other aspects of human well-being by changing how people can access or use the resource, or in some cases, access or use the market. That can result in cascading effects on well-being, either negatively or positively. And what we see as the policy implications of this work is that we have to pay careful attention to how these property rights are being reallocated as a result of our efforts to conserve marine ecosystems. And in some cases where it can cause displacement or affect the cohesion within communities, to have accessible conflict resolution mechanisms in place to address potential conflict that may arise. But underlying all of this is the fact that pre-existing inequalities within society and within many of these coastal communities, whether it be by ethnic groups or gender, we find that shapes who loses or who benefits from conservation. And so if we're going to move forward into a future where we are going to be implementing conservation with other shocks and drivers, such as rapid ocean development or climate change, we must seek to address the root drivers of inequality and vulnerability and focus on building general resilience to multiple drivers of change. And doing this, we cannot obviously do it alone, and will require forming new and unlikely partnerships between conservation and disaster management, education, and finance. So providing more holistic solutions to try to address root drivers of vulnerability and to build general resilience. The last part is that to show that evidence synthesis is a useful tool for synthesizing information that can inform science and practice. And tools like this can shed light on questions about how people are being affected by conservation, and also to answer WhatsApp messages from your mom on a Sunday evening. So after doing the search, I then was able to find a meta-analysis study that looked at the results of hundreds of papers or studies that looked at the associations between vaccines and autism. And the result was that they did not find an associated link when they were able to evaluate multiple studies and assess the strength and rigor of these different studies. And so we are continuing this evidence synthesis work as part of what we have at Duke Bass Connections project. And this is a vertically integrated project that brings together undergrads, grads, postdocs, faculty to try to address some important question for either sustainability or society. And in this work, we are trying to understand the impacts of tropical marine conservation on both social and ecological outcomes, and how does conservation lead to effects in seagrass, mangrove, and coral reefs. In this work, we're applying some machine learning and semi-automated processes to help sift through hundreds of thousands of papers. And we're able to build outputs such as an evidence map, which shows the distribution of studies by intervention types. So from land and water management all the way through to education and training, and the outcomes from the different studies. So from population and species outcomes all the way through to knowledge and behavior and governance. We identify where there are sort of gluts of research or huge pockets of research that, for example, in this case on species management and land and water management, as well as where there's scarcity of information. What are the ecosystem function and service outcomes from various conservation interventions? And so we are continuing this work. We're in our third year and hope to be to continue it and to invite other colleagues who are interested in evidence synthesis. So definitely a long list of thank yous and acknowledgements, but yeah, take a stop here for any questions.
Thank you very much, David. This was very interesting. Yeah, really fascinating work and certainly synthetic. So we usually have a Q&A. It can be pretty long today. So if anybody has any question, maybe you can say so in the chat, and then we'll call your name and you can ask it. And maybe to give folks some time, I will ask one. So in your work, in what you presented today, David, how did you go about classifying winners and losers? And like I mean, it's my ignorance. I don't know how it's done, but I was wondering if there's any way to consider uncertainty, or like whether somebody like an Asian considers themselves, a winner or a loser, or like in a self-reported way as opposed to an independent assessment. I guess like that could affect a lot the answer, right? Like maybe somebody is not benefited from an MPA, and just because they are not happy, they will say that they are harmed, but maybe there's no objective harm. How would you, like, is this something you encountered, and how did you do it?
Yeah, definitely. We kept careful notes of how the outcomes were reported, whether it be self-reported outcomes, so perception-based, as well as objective measures. And so oftentimes those were mostly outcomes related to income and whatnot. We see them rather than being contradictory, but complementary, where the researcher observed outcomes can give us a sense of objective well-being, but in order to understand how people perceive their well-being and subjective well-being or relational well-being, that's where we would have to rely on understanding perceptions and how people perceive they have been affected. Some cases where we had both, they were positively correlated. In other cases, they were negatively correlated, where the observed and the subjective and the perceptions differed. But definitely we see those as two types of, more as complementary to understanding overall well-being.
That's cool. Thanks. Catherine Siegel has a question.
Hi, David. Thanks for the talk. It's really cool to hear what you've been up to. I was wondering if you had a sense to what degree the papers you included in your analysis were using formal impact evaluation methods?
Very few. I don't have the percentage on top of my head, but I think it was less than 15% used what we call quasi-experimental approaches, where they try to account for changes that were a result, to isolate the changes that happen as a result of the intervention compared to those that were from other factors. Very few studies. I think there were only 2 or 3 that tried to apply an impact evaluation approach. And we did call for additional work on using these methods in the paper. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, we have another question from Rachel. I will read it, or you want to read it, Rachel?
Sure, I can read it, sorry. So I know you didn't have a lot of replication with the other approaches. MPA seemed to be the majority, but did you get a sense that any of these other approaches showed different outcomes or had more promises of being equitable? I'm just curious if there was maybe some preliminary trends you saw.
Yeah, definitely was hard to tell. In terms of the distribution of studies, it did align between interventions, most focused on trying to understand economic changes or changes in resource use rights. From the looking at the literature qualitatively, definitely those interventions that try to apply community-based approaches to decision-making and management where they were included, we did see those studies in quite a few cases report positive outcomes for the community. And so this lends support to the idea that if we are more equitable in the decision-making process, and perhaps that will lead to more equitable outcomes in the future.
Thank you.
Phoebe, you want to ask the question?
Sure. Hi, David. Thank you so much for a really engaging talk. I was just sort of wondering, because so much of these results, I guess, are very actually kind of emotional topics in many ways. I was wondering how it makes you feel at the end of this. Like, does it leave you feeling kind of hopeful or less hopeful about sort of the future of these types of conservation interventions? And then also sort of were the results about what you expected to see, or was there a particular piece of this that was really surprising to you?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we definitely tried to go in with an atheoretical approach where we just want to understand the distribution of literature. But then, yes, once you dive into it, being around so many social scientists, they will always tell you that the answer is always complex. Nuance and context matters. So definitely seeing the heterogeneity, that was expected. But I think what came out as surprising is how the consistency to which we saw how pre-existing inequalities had just continued throughout the intervention, or even in some cases it exacerbated in interventions. And you are hopeful, as being human, that you would come up with a lot of positive cases and the success stories, and they were there for sure. But definitely some of the cases where we saw negative outcomes was quite hard, and particularly some in that we saw, both the one that I mentioned in Tanzania as well as in Central America, where it actually resulted in violent conflict and homicide in some cases as a result of conflict or other factors that stemmed out of the intervention.
Wow. Our research does, usually doesn't touch on these topics, but this is very interesting. I have a related question, maybe not directly related to what you presented today, but I know that some of your past work assessed the importance of effective management. In your Nature paper, you showed how there is this widespread shortfall in financial resources and staff, and how that prevents MPAs from working as they should. How does that relate to winners and losers? I can, I mean, I don't know, but like one could think that if an MPA is not properly managed, I mean, I guess there should be more losers or maybe less equitable outcomes.
Yeah, thanks. And so the sort of the strength or rigor of studies that try to establish that empirical link between different aspects of management and social outcomes, it's just very limited. But what we do see, and what is suggested, is elements that relate to good governance in terms of inclusivity in the decision making. That should hopefully lead to more equitable outcomes. And in some of the places that we work with NGO partners, we do see this where efforts went into recognizing the rights of the local communities and their pre-existing customary management tenure rights and other ways that they have traditionally managed to use the resource. When that was factored into the design of marine protected areas, then we saw some positive outcomes, or we did not see the negative outcomes we would expect from the initial establishment. And research on that is still ongoing, but those are cases where we start to see the results that we hope to.
That's interesting. Thank you. I think Catherine has another question.
Sorry, I'm back. I was wondering, I mean, obviously you have a lot of experience collaborating with conservation NGOs, and you just brought up some of those experiences. And so I'm wondering how you communicate these findings to conservation NGOs in a way that encourages them to maybe think more critically about their interventions. Yeah,
well, actually, most of this work is done in collaboration with the NGOs. So they're involved in the process from the beginning. And so in terms of how this relates then to informing their work, we definitely already have a step in the door in that they are some of the co-authors on the work, and they are able to then think about, as the research emerges, how then that can influence their designs and strategies, for sure.
We have another question from Tara Seeley.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of like the way you define the conservation initiatives that you were analyzing, did they themselves range at all in terms of like, I guess I like see that some conservation prioritizes these like Western values, like this idea of nature should be like untouched. And then there's like another approach to conservation that use people as part of the landscape. And I'm sure there's like many other ways to conceptualize conservation. Like, did your work kind of like span the range of that at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you just brought up two, I think, of the main discourses that are seem to be in conflict in conservation today. So how going forward are we going to conserve marine or terrestrial resources? And it's often the conflict between nature as wilderness and where we exclude humans versus a more approach where we see humans as part of nature. Most of the research tended toward the Western style interventions where it is set up that you restrict and try to keep people out, and that is, I guess, it's influenced by the literature and what is out there and how we study and conceptualize conservation. And then some of the other types of literature that probably would involve even using more local or indigenous approaches to conservation. That we did not see as much of that in the corpus as we would expect. And so it is both the nature of our approach, definitely, when we apply these kind of systematic protocols to identify relevant studies, oftentimes some of these other types of work is excluded, and as well as a limit to what is out there on the effects of other types of approaches. The closest we got to is the community-based conservation and management strategies, and so in those cases, quite some of them were exactly that, where they were managed or designed by local communities, as opposed to a sort of a top-down structure.
Thank you. If nobody else has any question, have last chance to ask a question. Otherwise, please join me in thanking David Gill for this amazing talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. And yeah, happy to have you. See you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.